Okay, today we pick up with the new frontier in the Great Society. We're going to look at how President Kennedy is going to deal with the Cold War. But first he has to get elected. So we have the election of 1960, and the economy in 1960 in the U.S. is in a recession. And so that's a problem that he has to look at. Also, our foreign policy. We've got a lot of things going on foreign policy-wise that he's going to have to address as well. Things like the Soviet Sputnik, the satellite that they put up into space. The Soviets now have long-range missiles. That's another thing. The U-2 incident, where our spy plane, the U-2, is brought down by the Soviets. And also Cuba changing to communism is also going to be an issue. So, in the election of 1960, we have the Democrat John F. Kennedy, and his promise is that he's going to get America moving again. He is going up against Republican Richard M. Nixon, who had been the vice president under Eisenhower. And they have very similar positions on policy issues. Both Nixon and Kennedy, a lot of their speeches sounded very similar to each other. And so it's going to end up being a very close election. Kennedy will win 49.7% of the popular vote, and Nixon will win 49.6% of the popular vote. And Kennedy's going to win this election in 1960 by less than 120,000 votes total. Now, there's two factors that help him to win. The first is television, and the use of television in political campaigns, and the civil rights movement. Now, Kennedy, the candidate, as a candidate for the presidency, he had certain things that were for him and certain things that were kind of knocks against him. In terms of pros, he had a very well-organized campaign. He came from a very wealthy family that was politically inclined, so they knew how to run a political campaign that was slick and looked really good. Kennedy himself was very good-looking and had a lot of personal charisma and just attracted people to him. However, he had some things against him that people weren't very pleased about. For example, he was very young for a president. He was only 43 at the time, and going along with that, hand in hand, a lot of people assume that youth means a lot of inexperience, and he wasn't very experienced in national politics. The third thing against him is religion. He was a Roman Catholic, and there was a lot of concern that as a Roman Catholic, he's going to listen more to the Roman Catholic Pope as opposed to the American people. So there was a huge concern with that as well. So, like I said, television is going to be one of the reasons that he gets elected, and television will be used to as for political ads, and it will be used to influence people. The first ever televised debate between presidential candidates will take place in the election of 1960. Nixon agreed to do this because he wanted to expose Kennedy's inexperience through debate to show that you don't know what you're talking about, you don't have experience in this. However, what we find, or what candidates will find after this, is that there's more factors than just know-how in a political debate. In fact, most people focus on the image and not the expertise as the deciding factor in who they think won. When this debate is over, people who had listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon had won because he was more eloquent and more knowledgeable in his answers. But those that watched it on television were convinced that JFK had won the debate because he came across as much more professional looking and was much more calming in a way. His charisma comes across that way. The second thing, like I said, that helps him to win, or the second factor, is going to be the civil rights movement. And Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Not really worked together, but had influence over each other. There's going to be some major events that will help Kennedy's campaign and help him to get elected. The major event that happens right before the election is that Martin Luther King and other demonstrators are going to be arrested for sitting at a segregated lunch counter. And Kennedy will call Martin Luther King's wife to express sympathy for the fact that her husband was put into jail for a nonviolent demonstration. And then his brother, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, when Kennedy gets elected, Robert Kennedy will become his Attorney General. He's in charge of the Department of Justice. And he's going to work to persuade the judge to let King out on bail, to let him out of jail. And this news is going to capture the attention of the black community. And they're like, well, if he's willing to help out Martin Luther King, he might be willing to help us out and gain our civil rights. And so he gains a lot of votes that way as a result. Now, the Cold War is also going to occupy a lot of the president's time. JFK during the campaign was kind of scorned for not being all that concerned about the Soviet threat. And so he kind of gets a lot of flack about that. In the eyes of the Americans, the Soviets were winning the third world countries, those new and developing countries coming out of colonial rule. And it really doesn't help that on America's doorstep, communism is coming as well. Cuba is going to switch to communism, and that's right close to us. And we don't like that idea that it could hit so close to home. So JFK, when he becomes president in 1960, he is going to help redefine the nation's nuclear strategy. Under Eisenhower, we had that policy of mass destruction or massive retaliation. Remember, Eisenhower's Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, and he talked about MAD, that mutually assured destruction. We're going to make sure we're all dead. Kennedy, however, has a policy of flexible response, that we're going to strengthen our conventional forces, non-nuclear forces. That gives us more options in a crisis. So that way we aren't just tied to nuclear warfare. Well, the result of this is we're going to have a large increase in defense spending, because now we have to bulk up not only our nuclear war capabilities, but also our conventional war capabilities. Kennedy likes to use in his war strategy unconventional warfare, which is like insurgency or guerrilla warfare, not an all-out my army against your army. And he really likes to engage in low-intensity conflicts, or LICs, where we're not fully engaging all of our troops there. In order to do this unconventional warfare, he creates an elite branch of the military called the Green Berets, which their main job basically is to create counterinsurgency. They are supposed to infiltrate a country and get people up in arms and make sure that they are pro-American. He's also going to triple the nuclear capabilities of the United States. So we're not only going with Green Berets and are more conventional, but we're also stepping up our nuclear capabilities as well. But what this does is it gives us a lot of flexibility, flexible response. So we're able to fight limited wars, and we're able to maintain our nuclear balance with the Soviets. Eventually, we will have a couple of crises that happen over Cuba. Cuba had been a developing problem prior to the 1960s. Eisenhower had cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba when Fidel Castro, who was a revolutionary leader in Cuba, declared himself to be a communist, and he's going to start welcoming aid from the Soviet Union. Now, how Castro gets power is through American help. We help him because he promised democracy for Cuba. And we were able to get rid of Batista, who was sort of corrupt and unpopular in Cuba. Now, we're very suspicious of Castro, but we at first recognize his government because he promises he's going to become democratic. And then he doesn't. And for Americans, Castro was like a freedom fighter. He's fighting for the freedom of the Cuban people. However, the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. is going to worsen. Cuba is going to take over a lot of American and British-held territory, like oil refineries in Cuba. They give away land to peasants from the larger corporations, so it's like communism. He takes over the American sugar companies in Cuba and gives that land away. And so the American sugar companies are going to ask the United States for help. Can't you stop this? And Congress is going to pass trade barriers on Cuban sugar as a way to say, you really shouldn't be doing this. Castro, as a result, is going to rely more and more on the Soviets for help, and he begins to repress his people. For some Cubans, they were very supportive of Castro because he's standing up to the United States, who tends to be a little heavy-handed when dealing with other countries. We like countries to do what we tell them to do, and Castro wasn't doing that. And so some Cubans were like, hey, that's awesome. But for other Cubans, he was a traitor to the revolution. He was not delivering on his promises, and so they felt very betrayed by him. About 10% of Cuba's population is going to go into exile. They escape from Cuba and they come to the United States. So that is going to lead us into the Bay of Pigs. President Eisenhower is going to give the CIA permission to train those exiles that come to the United States for an invasion into Cuba. And the hope is that they would overthrow Castro and eventually Cuba would become democratic. Now, Kennedy is going to learn about this whole operation that's in the works about 9 days after he is elected president. He has doubts about it. He doesn't know if he really should go ahead with it, but he approves it anyway and promises air support. Basically, he was told by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that it's a go-ahead, we're okay, we'll make it work. And so he just kind of puts his stamp of approval on it. It's not something he actually came up with the idea for. So on April 17th, 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles are going to land at Bahia de Cochinos, or the Bay of Pigs. Now, there was an airstrike 2 days before, but the airstrike was not as successful as it was supposed to have been. It failed to disable the Cuban Air Force. A small command unit is going to be sent in to distract Castro's forces, but they don't reach shore. In fact, they show up about an hour late because they forgot to set their watches ahead. They were coming in from Guatemala, which is a different time zone, and so they forgot to set their watches, and they are behind schedule. So the troops landed. They had an airstrike already that was unsuccessful. The Cubans are on alert, and the troops land, and they face 20,000 Cubans backed by Soviet tanks and jet aircraft. And so they're surrounded, some are killed, and the vast majority of them are taken prisoner. Now, Kennedy ends up getting very embarrassed by this situation, but he accepts the blame for it because he did sign his name saying that this is an okay order. But he's forced to negotiate with Castro for the release of the prisoners. And eventually the U.S. pays a ransom of $53 million in food and medical supplies to Castro. So it ends up being this huge debacle. It's a big embarrassment. And so Kennedy's kind of left with a chip on his shoulder that how can we prove ourselves? How can we show that this is not normal for us? That this is not how we are going to engage in our policy with the Soviets and with the Cubans. And so that's going to bring about the Cuban Missile Crisis later. In 1961, we get a new Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev had promised to defend Cuba with Soviet arms. He promises that if Cuba is attacked by the U.S., he will be there to help them out. So the summer of 62 comes around, and we discover that there's a flow of weapons going into Cuba. And this is going to begin including nuclear weapons. And they're called the SS-5s. These SS-5s were capable of hitting all U.S. cities with the exception of Seattle, but pretty much anywhere else in the continental U.S. they could hit. On October 14th of 62, a U-2 plane is going to fly over Cuba, and it takes photos. And these photos are going to provide us with evidence of missile bases that are being built by the Soviets in Cuba. And these missiles could reach the U.S. in a matter of minutes and annihilate us. And we're not happy about this. On October 22nd, Kennedy is going to announce that these missile bases exist and that he has plans to remove them. Any missile attack from Cuba that is launched on the United States would initiate an all-out attack by us on the Soviet Union. We're not even going to mess with Cuba. We're going to go after the Soviet Union because we know that they're the ones behind it. Well, eventually we have 6 days of tension, very high tensions going on in the U.S. Soviet ships that were possibly carrying more nukes are heading to Cuba. And so we have to figure out what to do with them. Are we going to allow them to continue bringing nuclear weapons into Cuba and put us in even more danger? And so what is decided is that the U.S. Navy is going to set up a quarantine around Cuba. We're not going to set up a blockade because a blockade would be an act of war. Instead, we're sending up a quarantine that we're protecting Cuba basically from Soviet influence. And so we would allow no ships within 500 miles of the island. About 200,000 U.S. forces are going to be sent to Florida in the possibility or the probability that we would have to invade Cuba. Now, a break in the tension comes when the Soviet ships are halted by a Soviet command in order to avoid a confrontation. And a few days later, Khrushchev is going to offer to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge or American promise to not invade Cuba. And we agree to that, and the crisis is averted. Now, Khrushchev, his prestige is going to be harmed by this because it looks like he backed down. And so it's a bad mark for him. JFK comes out looking like the winner, but he himself is not going to get away unscathed either. Some Americans felt that he brought us too close to nuclear war, that it was an unnecessary move. Others felt that he was too soft, and he passed up a chance to get rid of Castro. And so these are the kinds of things that Kennedy and other presidents later on are going to have to deal with in terms of the Cold War.